Frank Lenz's love for riding a bicycle began when he was a teenager. For him, it was a perfect escape. He was naturally handsome, charming, and popular, but his childhood was still far from perfect. He was born in Philadelphia in 1867. His parents came to America from Germany only 2 years earlier. And shortly after Frank was born, his father died. His mother, Anna, quickly remarried, and the new family moved to Pittsburg. Pittsburg in the late 1800s was inspirational for young, ambitious boys like Frank. Pittsburg was home to Andrew Carnegie's U.S. Steel Corporation. Before football was ever invented, the original Pittsburgh Steelers were forging America's new railroads, bridges, and skyscrapers. It was also where George Westinghouse first started tinkering with electrical gadgets. In fact, Frank's stepfather worked at a Westinghouse factory. As a young man, Frank saw penniless immigrants become famous tycoon millionaires, and things that were only previously imagined were turned into reality. The atmosphere in his hometown encouraged Frank's ambition. By 16, Frank was already working with a good salary as an accountant at a local factory. His mother was so proud of him. Anna loved her son dearly, but Frank didn't always get along well with his stepfather. His bicycle, though, allowed him to forget any troubles. For Frank, it was always thrilling. Almost immediately, cycling grew to become Frank's passion in life. He rode whenever he could, most often with his best friend, a fellow cyclist named Charlie Petticord. They rode together almost every day and joined a cycling club in Pittsburgh comprised of about 30 other passionate riders. Club members kept records of their long rides. In 1887 and 1888, Frank logged over 4,000 miles, the most for any cyclist in the entire state of Pennsylvania. The cycling clubs also organized races. Frank entered his first race in 1887. Often, spectators attended the races and cheered on their favorite riders, and the results were printed in local newspapers. Frank learned a couple things about himself in those first races he entered. First, that he loved the feeling when folks were cheering for him. He wanted fame. He wanted adoring fans. And second, that he didn't win many races. He most often finished third or fourth. By the 1890s, Frank's mother imagined her clever, ambitious son, the teenaged accountant, would soon be settling down and getting married and having a family of his own. Frank was focusing, though, his ambition on his passion, his bicycle. He imagined that he'd soon be seeing his name in print and seeing crowds roaring in approval as he cycled past them. But Frank had come to accept that he wasn't quite fast enough to be a champion racer, which to him only meant that he'd have to find some other way that he and his bicycle could leave their mark on the world. The Frenchman Pierre Lemont introduced his new velocipede in 1865. It was the first two-wheeled, balanced vehicle pedaled by the rider. In the 1860s and 1870s, bicycles were mainly used like toys. They were for the wealthy, often referred to as dandy horses. Cycling was recreational, and people usually only rode around in designated locations that sort of resembled roller rinks. The first models were propelled by pedals that were attached at the center of the bicycle's front wheel. Soon, thrill-seeking cyclists came to realize that the frontward location of the pedals meant that riders could gain more speed and distance per thrust if the front wheel was big. The bigger the front wheel, the faster the ride. Also, With the front wheel larger than the back, the cyclist could more comfortably sit directly and straight over the pedals. Thus, in the late 1800s, the front wheels kept getting bigger and bigger until some were over 6 feet tall. The problem, though, was that these big wheels were dangerous. There were several cyclists who had fallen on their heads and died, and countless broken arms and wrists. Soon, an English manufacturer developed a new model of bicycle they called the Rover. The Rover, which used a chain and sprocket to propel the rear wheel, was marketed as the new safety bicycle. Now, the rider could sit much lower, but still be directly over the pedals. Also, rather than previously used steel or wood wheels, the safety bicycle had rubber tires. Frank Lenz hated the safety. He and his cycling club mates always preferred their big wheels, which they started calling ordinary bicycles. Cycling purists or traditionalists rode ordinaries, not safeties. Maybe for young athletic men, the risk of injury was part of the appeal. For the rest of America, however, the safety became a pop culture sensation. By 1890, millions of Rover safeties had been sold. Men, women, and children were all riding bicycles, both for recreation and for transport. In fact, for most people, bicycles were the fastest means of transportation on American roads. So, what had been Frank Lenz's passion for years was now the latest trend. And the American public's exploding interest in bicycles just might present great opportunity for a young man seeking fame and fortune like him. Between 1884 and 1887, Outing magazine published the journals and sketches of a man named Thomas Stevens. Stevens was the first person to ride a bicycle around the world. Over 33 months, he traveled over 13,000 miles and became an instant national celebrity. The journals tracked his journey, and the sketches drawn by Stevens himself illustrated the things he saw. Frank Lenz read his articles every month, and Thomas Stevens became one of his idols. In the summers of 1888 and 1889, Frank and his best friend, Charlie Petticord, focused more on long rides than on races. He and Charlie rode all over Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York. Soon, Frank understood what motivated Thomas Stevens and why so many people enjoyed his journals and sketches so much. For Frank, the long rides were much more satisfying than races. He and Charlie were now seeing new places and meeting many interesting people, and like Stevens, Frank decided that he wanted to document his rides as well. And just as Frank's focus was shifting to longer rides in 1888, a man named George Eastman, the founder of Kodak in Rochester, New York, began selling the world's first portable camera. Frank had to have one. Thomas Stevens' sketches were very popular, but wouldn't people enjoy seeing real photographs even more? Frank bought a Kodak camera and learned how to use it. He fabricated a specialized backpack to carry the camera with him while riding and formulated a system of mailing exposed plates to himself along the way to keep a light load. Then, in August 1889, Frank and Charlie rode to New York City together. Afterward, thinking other people might find his pictures of this trip to be interesting, Frank sent them to a little magazine called Atlantic Athlete. To Frank's great delight, his pictures were published. The magazine even included a notation praising Frank's innovative use of the mail to keep his cargo manageable. Frank and Charlie took their longest ride together in August 1891. It was over 1,200 miles to New Orleans, Louisiana. Frank's plan for this trip was to take as many pictures as possible and use them to convince a publisher, any publisher, to sponsor him on his very own journey by bicycle around the world. In planning the New Orleans trip, Frank was ever inventive. He made a sort of umbrella hat to protect his face and equipment from the sun and rain. And he fashioned a long hose to his camera, which sent a signal through the hose to the camera when his bicycle tires rolled over it. This way, he was able to take pictures of himself while riding. After returning from New Orleans, he wrote to essentially every publisher in America. He expressed that his world tour would be longer than Thomas Stevens, that he'd cover all terrain by bicycle, no matter the weather, and best of all, that he'd send back actual photographs of his journey and adventures. With each letter, Frank included sample photographs from his ride to New Orleans. 6 weeks later, an envelope arrived at Frank's home. It was addressed to him, and the return address indicated it was sent from James Henry Werman, publisher, Outing Magazine. James Werman, the publisher of Outing Magazine, would sponsor Frank's trip around the world. He offered Frank $4,000 plus expenses for a 2-year trip, and Frank would send back monthly journals and photographs. But Mr. Werman insisted Frank had to ride the new safety bicycle. The public loved and wanted to see the safety. Frank would have to set aside his beloved big wheel. Frank, though, conceded to all the terms. For him, the opportunity to go at all was a dream come true. Frank's mother, Anna, wasn't as keen on the idea, however. In fact, Frank's mother begged him not to go. She knew there'd be dangers. Most of all, she feared the unknown. The publisher, Mr. Werman, illustrated those dangers quite clearly, too, when he purchased a life insurance policy for $3,000 and presented it to Frank's mother. Maybe Anna should have known, though. There was no way Frank would say no. Frank Lenz spent the next 5 months preparing for his around-the-world tour. He visited Washington, D.C. to secure his passport and permissions to travel abroad. Then Secretary of State James Blaine met with Frank personally and provided him with an official letter of support from the U.S. Department of State. Frank crafted a new backpack and belt with pouches for supplies and organized a trunk containing clean clothes and spare bicycle parts, which he'd continually dispatch ahead of himself as he traversed from city to city. He planned the trip going west. At Mr. Werman's insistence, he had to begin in New York City, at Outing Magazine's headquarters. He'd cover North America first, all the way to California, then cross the Pacific by steamship, and then cycle across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, and 2 years later, ship home across the Atlantic. Before leaving for New York City, his cycling club in Pittsburg celebrated his forthcoming adventures with a grand banquet. Here, they presented Frank with a gift, an engraved Smith & Wesson revolver, just in case. He left home in May of 1892. Frank felt ready. He strapped his camera to his back, affixed placards to his wheels which announced to everyone he was on a world tour, and wore a hat that read Outing across the front. Frank rode out of Pittsburg with a crowd of 800 people gathered near him, waving and wishing him good luck. In New York, Mr. Werman spoke to Frank one more time, offering his best wishes as well. Immediately afterward, his journey officially began. As Frank started westward, an impromptu collection of over 100 New York cyclers escorted him out of the city. People now knew about Frank Lenz and celebrated him. Only 5,000 miles to go to San Francisco. In the state of New York, Frank rode through Albany, Syracuse, and, appropriately, Rochester, home to the Kodak Company, and then on to Buffalo and Niagara Falls. To enter Canada, customs agents waived the usual fees after Frank showed them the letter from U.S. Secretary of State James Blaine. He saw the Canadian countryside in Ontario and the city in Toronto. He then dipped back into the U.S. through Detroit, Ann Arbor, South Bend, Indiana, and Chicago. He got to Chicago just as the city was preparing for the 1892 World Columbian Exposition, celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's American arrival. He saw the famed White City under construction. Frank was just a bit too early to see one of the exposition's most lasting attractions. George Ferris, also from Pittsburgh, was just preparing to erect his invention, the Ferris wheel, which he modeled after the big front wheel of the ordinary bicycle that Frank loved so much. It had been a full month now, and from Chicago, Frank sent his first report and photos back east for publication in Outing magazine. Then it was on to Racine, Milwaukee, and Lake Minnetonka in Minnesota. For the first time, Frank saw real teepees in South Dakota. He spoke to one Western Indian who looked at Frank, then looked at his bicycle, then looked back up at Frank and simply said, "Good horse." He reached Montana by August, where Frank encountered his first brush with danger. While trying to ford the raging Yellowstone River, his bicycle and supplies were swept away. Frank was able to swim to safety and, thankfully, recovered his bicycle, although miles downstream. In the western deserts, more than once, cactus needles annoyingly popped his tires, and he noted immense wildfires in Idaho. He was surprised to see ubiquitous electricity in the West, but also decried the ubiquitous drinking and gambling. Frank reported that Oregon's Columbia River Gorge was the most spectacular sight in North America, although riding through it left him caked with dirt and disheveled. In fact, after crossing the Columbia River, he arrived, still tattered and dirty, at the Portland hotel he was scheduled to spend the night at. The clerk, mistaking Frank for a vagrant, meanly commanded him to leave the building. Only later did the clerk realize that this vagrant was actually the guest of honor at a reception the hotel was hosting that evening. Frank entered California just before winter in October 1892. He arrived as scheduled to San Francisco. It had been 6 months. He had covered over 5,000 miles. Apparently, completing the North American leg of his world tour was, for Frank Lenz, a cause for celebration. On his last night on the continent, he was arrested by a San Francisco police officer and charged with public drunkenness. The night before his boat, the Oceanic, was set to sail for Asia, Frank Lenz was sitting in a San Francisco jail cell. The next morning, Officer John Green explained to the judge that Mr. Lenz was very drunk and being very loud at a very late hour. The officer indicated that initially he didn't intend to arrest Mr. Lenz, except that when the drunk man was asked to go home, he refused, declaring that he would not be going home until he had crossed the Tartar Desert. Lucky for Frank, when the judge learned he was scheduled for the next ship across the Pacific, the charges were dropped and he was released. Later that day, Frank and about 500 others boarded the Oceanic en route to Asia, with a single-day stop in Hawaii, which Frank used to explore Honolulu. In 1892, Hawaii was an independent monarchy. Frank's only photograph from Hawaii shows him standing in front of Queen Liliuokalani's palace. Frank was impressed by the Hawaiians he met. He was surprised to find almost all of them spoke English. He wrote that they were polite and had beautiful and intellectual countenances. The Oceanic landed at Yokohama Harbor in Japan on November 14th. Before anyone was allowed off the ship, the crew first carried off the 3 passengers who had died during the crossing. He spent a month in Japan and was delighted by everything he saw there. He found the lakes, mountains, and beaches all to be beautiful. Little Japanese boys always waved and smiled as he rode past them. Once, an old blind man, after hearing how long Frank had been traveling, insisted on providing the cyclist with a massage. Frank said the Japanese women were beautiful, but too many of them were prostitutes. He couldn't believe that most of them were forced into the practice by their parents. Frank saw the cities of Yokohama, Hiroshima, Kyoto, and finally Nagasaki. In December, as 1892 came to a close, he took a short cruise to Shanghai, China. China was nearly the opposite of Japan. Frank described Shanghai as being a walled city of 200,000 unfortunates living in cramped quarters amid fearful odors and scores of beggars and cripples. He was revolted by the Chinese practice of binding girls' feet, writing that some girls' feet were not more than 3 inches long and left the women stumping along on pegs. In China, Frank mainly rode along telegraph lines, which were being newly installed all over the country. The lines helped provide direction, and periodically, small telegraph houses, owned by American and European companies, provided accommodations and more familiar faces, even in the most rural regions. Chinese locals, especially in provincial areas, most often didn't treat him kindly like the Japanese. In a letter home to his best friend Charlie Petticord, Frank wrote that the Chinese were most often afraid of him. Their favorite epithet for the cyclist was Flying Devil. When Frank couldn't find a telegraph or missionary house to sleep in, he would search for, as he expressed, some cold nook among the rocks, hoping to stay sufficiently hidden. For the dead of winter, Frank stayed with a missionary family, also from Pennsylvania. This period included the month-long national celebration of the Chinese New Year. During this time, Frank saw everything in China became more colorful and more friendly. He returned to his travels in early March. Shortly after, he encountered a village of farmers who found him and his bicycle particularly abhorrent. Frank was used to being called names by now, but this time it was different. Here, they formed a mob and chased him. In trying to outrun them, Frank inadvertently pedaled himself into a tight spot, leaving himself trapped between the mob and the face of a massive cliff. It was the first time Frank took out that just-in-case gun. He fired a shot into the air. Neither the sight of it nor the shot fazed the mob. They continued toward him. One of the men swung his hoe at Frank, hitting him on the face and knocking him off his bicycle. Frank's face was bleeding as the farmers began grabbing and breaking his supplies. Scared for his life, he did next what for some reason popped into his mind. He grabbed his bicycle and, kind of melodramatically, took a tight hold of the handlebars. He then placed his feet on the pedals and gave them a couple of embellished, exaggerated pumps. Then, he purposefully and wildly caused himself to fall off of the bicycle in a way that a clown or a fool might do. Frank's appeal to humanity's common sense of humor might very well have saved his life. His little stooge act worked. His attackers were basically dumbfounded by his antics, just enough for Frank to ride away. He lost his camera, he had broken ribs, and his face was busted, but he escaped. Frank later wrote, "It seems there may be some universal understanding amongst all corners of humanity. The devil doesn't have much of a sense of humor." Frank reached China's western border, the Mekong River, in May of 1893. Here, in a letter to his mother, Frank wrote he just calculated that he had now traveled more than halfway around the globe. And he added affectionately to his mother that this meant he was now on his way home. Frank Lenz crossed the border into Burma just before summer in 1893. Burma and India, which was next for Frank, were both British colonies in 1893. Here, he was no longer called the Flying Devil. Also, the British presence and economic support meant better roads and safer travels. Frank vowed that now out of China, he'd never set foot in that country again. The problem for him here, though, was the weather. The monsoons arrived early in 1893, bringing the incessant rains and floods that accompany them, and on most days the temperature neared 100 degrees Fahrenheit. He stayed in Mandalay for about a month. Here, he saw his first tiger, leopard, and elephant. Rangoon had a cycling club of its own. Its members gave Frank the treatment. They fixed up his bicycle and paid for him to stay in a luxury hotel. As Frank entered India in September 1893, he wrote to his friend Charlie that he was happy, well, and in the best of spirits. Frank described Calcutta, India as a thoroughly Western kind of city, although overpopulated by both humans and cows. He noted that British occupation seemed to him to be understandably invasive, but had spawned a thriving economy. The city's largest building was the brand new University of Calcutta, part of Britain's economic stimulus. It would eventually grow into 27 colleges, including India's first college of medicine and its first college for women. The Brits are now long gone, but the university remains, much bigger now, right where Frank Lenz saw it in 1893. In India, he visited the Taj Mahal, and he saw for the first time lions, monkeys, and cobras. Frank had been at it now for 17 months and for over 10,000 miles, although he was also now 6 months behind schedule. Originally, he had planned to next ride through the mountains of Afghanistan, but as he was behind schedule, if he minded his original plan, he'd have been beginning that trek as winter approached. So, he modified the agenda a bit. He'd forego Afghanistan and instead ride through the desert in Persia. This would allow him to avoid the brutal winter in the mountains and hopefully make up some of his lost time. Also, the new plan would get him to Europe sooner, which for him was his sort of grand finale. He spent New Year's Day of 1894 in a city called Gwadur, near the eastern border of Persia. The most indelible aspect of Persia for him was the dozens of earthquakes he felt. Frank found the Persian nomads to be greatly generous. They always gave him lots of food and drinks, but in more urban areas, Frank often felt unwelcome. They didn't think he was the devil like in China, but they knew he was an infidel. Notwithstanding Frank's heresy, he formed a friendship with the empire's crown prince in Tehran, Mozaffar al-Din. Al-Din knew Frank was visiting and requested to meet him. The crown prince was fascinated by the bicycle and the camera and also by Frank himself. Years later, when he was Shah, al-Din would send a note to Frank's mother expressing his great respect for her son. Tehran was a truly international city. Frank met lots of people from Europe and even a few Americans there. The Westerners he met often provided him with the same piece of advice, that he should at whatever cost avoid riding through Turkey. In the 1890s, Turkey was crumbling into civil war. It was lawless and overrun by bandits. Westerners, and especially Christians, were not being treated well there. Frank heard all of this and considered his options. He could go north and detour through Russia to Europe, but then he'd fall even further behind schedule. Well, he was now hoping to make up time that he'd already lost. Frank wanted decisively to just get through the Middle East and into Europe as quickly as possible. So he decided he would simply travel the fastest route. Frank Lenz rode out of Persia. going due west toward Turkey. During his trip, Frank wrote to his mother, Anna, and separately to his best friend Charlie Petticord every month. The note he sent to his mother in April of 1894 expressed that he was doing quite well, now in a city called Erzurum in Turkey. It was just about that time that Anna might also have seen in her local newspaper reports about growing civil unrest in the same region. The magnitude of the unrest at the time wasn't fully discernible, but history books would later more often describe it as genocide. Curiously, Charlie Petticord didn't receive anything from Frank in April 1894. Likewise, Frank failed to send his monthly report and photographs to James Werman in New York for publication in Outing magazine that month. Frank had never previously missed a deadline, but considering the many variables that could have preoccupied him or the mail service, it didn't cause too much immediate concern. But when nobody heard from Frank in May, and then also in June, his mother's wonder turned to worry. Then, in July, Anna received a telegram from the Thomas Cook Travel Agency, which had been handling Frank's supply trunk throughout his trip. They had Frank's trunk in their office in Constantinople, and it had been there for nearly 2 months. Frank never came to collect it. Also, about the same time, Mr. Werman realized Frank wasn't cashing the checks he'd sent. By mid-July, it was clear to all of them something was wrong. The April 1894 letter to his mother had been Frank's last correspondence with anyone. It wasn't until the beginning of August that James Werman contacted the U.S. consuls in Tehran and Constantinople. That's when newspapers across the United States also ran their first stories that Frank was missing. The Globetrotting Cyclist had disappeared. Frank Lenz quickly became a matter of international political diplomacy abroad and a popular story of mysterious intrigue at home. Why wasn't Frank corresponding? Was he even alive? Was he ill? Was he kidnapped? Was he killed by bandits? Was he hurt in a fall off his bicycle or off the side of a mountain? His mother, Anna, and Charlie Petticord in Pittsburgh, and James Werman in New York were left speculating as much as the newspapers. They might have assumed that the U.S. Department of State, fully aware of Frank's disappearance, was employing all possible resources to find him. But after 2 months passed with no news about Frank, everyone, including the American public, began growing impatient. The reality was, however, that turmoil in Turkey was both consuming much of the U.S. consulate's time and making a proper investigation quite difficult. More months passed without answers. American newspapers started filling the void with imaginative and sensational theories. One claimed Frank voluntarily ran away. Another claimed he'd been sighted in Russia and was now working in the oil industry. Another said he'd been arrested by the Turks as a spy. The most fanciful story claimed Frank had decided to remain in Persia, living there and disguising himself as a Muslim in order to gain entry into all of Persia's ancient Islamic temples. Soon, his family and friends and his cycling club mates back in Pittsburgh had had enough. They worked together to organize their own investigation. They wrote letters, hundreds of letters, to every missionary, travel agency, foreign diplomat, and businessman known or thought to have recently been in Asia or the Middle East. Hoping to outfit their own search party to Turkey, they collected hundreds of donations. Mr. Werman heard back from the consul in Turkey for the first time in December. U.S. officials indicated they'd made contacts with local authorities, but were getting no cooperation, and that the situation in Turkey made further investigation impossible. By the end of 1894, the number of dead in eastern Turkey was in the hundreds of thousands. Mainly, Christian Armenians and Westerners were being slaughtered by Kurdish Muslims. The Ottoman government had little motivation to cooperate in an investigation of Frank's disappearance. Even if they did care, they were totally preoccupied. Likewise, U.S. officials were trying to navigate this growing humanitarian crisis. Understandably, the U.S. State Department was focused on helping any remaining Americans leave the region and not on sending anyone in to investigate Frank's case. What little progress was made to discover Frank's fate by the end of 1894 came from the letters the cycling club sent. Most of the responses came from missionaries, some of whom related meeting Frank. The sightings were chronicled and formed a fairly reliable timetable of Frank's last known whereabouts. They ascertained that whatever Frank's misfortune was, it probably came in eastern Turkey, near the city of Erzurum, and he most likely encountered it on May 7th, 1894. Thousands of people had been following Frank's world tour in Outing magazine. Many readers felt they'd gotten to know Frank quite well. Months passed without answers. The magazine didn't report on the investigation or provide updates or even make reference to Frank after he went missing. To Frank's admirers and supporters, it was as if the magazine didn't care enough about discovering what happened to Frank Lenz. Eventually, the readers' displeasure shifted their focus to the publisher, James Werman. Many people who cared about Frank wondered, how was it possible that his cycling club friends had organized a more successful investigation from Pittsburg than both the U.S. State Department in Washington and Mr. Werman, a wealthy connected businessman in New York? Mr. Werman agreed that the State Department had failed Frank and everyone who loved him. Werman realized he should be doing more. And now, additionally, his business and his good reputation were also at stake. So James Werman resolved that he would personally organize and fund an expedition to Turkey to investigate what happened to Frank. If he couldn't rely on the U.S. government, he'd do it himself, and he wouldn't stop until he knew what happened to Frank Lenz. James Werman hired William Saddleben in December 1894. He was 28 years old from a small town in Illinois. Like Frank Lenz, he was German. His name, originally pronounced Sackleben, was Americanized to Saddleben. Saddleben had been a cycling globetrotter as well. He'd even previously briefly visited Turkey. Saddleben accepted this challenging task with energy and optimism. He assured Mr. Werman, Frank's family and friends, and the American public that he was going to do everything possible to solve the case. His first challenge was to figure out how to simply get into Turkey. Fighting had intensified. Most of eastern Turkey was under martial law, and the Ottoman government viewed virtually all Westerners and Western people as a threat to their hold of the empire. They banned all foreign entry before Saddleben even started to prepare. It took 2 months of negotiations for Saddleben to get permission to enter Turkey, and even then, he was only allowed in Constantinople, which was 1,200 miles from Erzurum, Frank's last known location. William Saddleben arrived in Constantinople on March 2nd, 1895. It was nearly a year after Frank's mother received his last letter. Constantinople was the only real international city in Turkey. Any U.S. officials in the country were in and stayed in Constantinople. Saddleben first contacted the U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, a Texan named Alexander Terrell. Terrell was a nearly 70-year-old no-nonsense former Confederate military officer. In his mind, boys like Frank Lenz and William Saddleben were foolish for wanting to ride bicycles through war-torn Dark Age countries. Tyrrell's goal in agreeing to meet with Saddleben was to convince him to immediately go home for his own good and everyone else's. Ambassador Tyrrell explained that Frank's case was nearly a year old. Turkey was currently the most dangerous place in the world. Both the people and government hated Americans, and they'd certainly offer no help with the investigation. He told Saddleben he'd have a better chance of getting killed than solving the case. Saddleben maybe stubbornly wasn't convinced. Before they parted, Tyrrell, noting Saddleben's persistence, said he'd try to secure permission for him to travel to Erzurum. Saddleben was now stuck in Constantinople, but started investigating as much as he could from there. He visited the Thomas Cook travel agency and retrieved Frank's unclaimed trunk. Saddleben then spoke to any American missionaries still in the city, including one named Henry Dwight. And Dwight told Saddleben that once a Turkish boy, about 15 years old, told him that one day while he was riding his bicycle, he was stopped by a soldier. The soldier, commenting on the bicycle, told the boy he'd recently seen a man riding a similar bicycle be shot and killed for it. This story was 3 layers deep in hearsay, but illustrated for Saddleben how an investigation on the scene and on the ground might start churning. After a full month passed in Constantinople, Saddleben was convinced Tyrrell wasn't going to get him permission for entry to Erzurum, so he took matters into his own hands. It only took Saddleben one day, a $50 bill, and a Turkish official willing to accept a bribe. Saddleben arrived in Erzurum on May 13th, 1895. He lamented as he crossed Turkey that it was disheartening to know that the future of every boy he saw was predetermined. They would all become soldiers. In Erzurum, Saddleben quickly met a Canadian missionary named William Chambers, who invited the investigator to live at his home. William Chambers and William Saddleben then went together for a meeting with the British consul in the city, a man named Robert Graves. Chambers and Graves both knew about Frank Lenz. They had previously spoken to locals about it, and Graves also reported he had newly uncovered information to impart. Recently, an informant had come to Graves and told him that 6 Kurdish men robbed and murdered Frank Lenz. Robert Graves had their names. Graves said he considered the informant to be reliable, and Saddleben found the account at least interesting, as it vaguely corroborated the story Henry Dwight told him from the 15-year-old Turkish boy. All 3 of them, Saddleben, Chambers, and Graves, were encouraged, and they agreed to work together to try and solve the case. First, they canvassed villages surrounding Erzurum. To Saddleben's surprise and delight, several people knew something about Frank Lenz. One Turkish guard had seen Lenz in a village called Diaden. Another claimed to remember him being in a village called Karakalisa and added a date, May 9th. Another Armenian told Chambers he'd seen Lenz in a village called Chilkani and recalled that the cyclist spent that night at the house of a farmer named Avak Parseg. A group of villagers in a town called Zedekan reported that right after Frank Lenz disappeared, they found a corpse in a river running near their homes. They reported it, but didn't know what became of it. Near the same river, 5 Armenians showed Saddleben some bicycle parts they'd found scattered in the dirt around their village. Saddleben didn't know if these parts were Frank's, but he knew bicycles were quite rare in this region. He asked the Armenians to hang on to them, thinking they could be valuable as evidence later. One name surfaced multiple times, that of a Kurdish man named Mushto. Multiple people reported that Mushto had been for a long time trying to sell them a bicycle. None of them, though, wanted to buy it. Some indicated that they'd also seen bicycle parts for sale at a local bazaar. Saddleben was accomplishing exactly what he hoped. He was gathering lots of leads and analyzing the information for any consistencies. To him, at this time, a clear picture was developing. Frank Lenz was most likely robbed and killed along a river near Erzurum sometime around May 10th, 1894. The perpetrators were possibly the Kurdish gang Graves had learned about. Saddlebin also wanted to find and speak to Mushto. Saddlebin now felt confident Frank Lenz wasn't alive. So now he'd be working to discover how Frank died, and if he was murdered, who did it, so they could be brought to justice. And more than anything, he desperately wanted to find Frank's remains. He wanted to make sure Frank Lenz could be sent home to his mother. William Saddlebin found evidence and rumors that Frank Lenz was murdered in nearly every village near Erzurum. Multiple people said they'd seen a cyclist shot. Others reported finding a corpse. Bicycles and bicycle parts were witnessed all over the region. Now, Saddlebin needed to link these accounts to the perpetrators. He wanted to find the Kurdish men whose names were on the informant's list given to British Consul Robert Graves. And he also wanted to speak with Mushto, also a Kurdish man, who'd been seen by many trying to sell a bicycle. Saddlebin had a problem emerging, though. All his potential suspects were Kurdish Muslims, and nearly all of the witnesses were Armenian Christians. In 1895, the Ottoman Empire controlled this region of eastern Turkey. The main ethnic groups in eastern Turkey were Kurdish Muslims and the much smaller group Armenian Christians. By this time, for years, the Ottoman Turks had been using Kurdish forces to kill, expel, or convert Armenians living in eastern Turkey. Saddlebin wondered if Armenians could be lying and trying to implicate Kurdish men for revenge or to protect themselves. And if the Armenians were providing the truth and Lenz's killers were Kurds, would Turkish officials actually arrest and prosecute Kurds based on Armenian accusations? And if they did arrest Kurds, would Armenian witnesses be brave enough to publicly testify in court against Kurds, knowing it would mean they'd likely become targets? Further, Saddlebin knew that going forward, his inquiry would be much more complex. He could talk to anyone he pleased, but that part was done now. He didn't have the authority to compel anyone to answer questions or to search their homes, and certainly not to make arrests. The U.S. ambassador back in Constantinople, old Alexander Terrell, was insistent that the Turkish government cared very little about helping solve the Lenz case. Terrell's assertion proved true on Saddlebin's very first appeal for help from local authorities. Saddlebin met with the Vali of Erzurum, a position similar to that of something like city mayor. The Vali was a man named Haki Pasha. When the subject of Frank Lenz was broached, Pasha flippantly and dismissively exclaimed that the cyclist died after getting too drunk and falling off a cliff. Saddlebin already knew Alexander Terrell wouldn't be helpful, and now he knew the local government probably wouldn't be helpful either. So, Saddlebin developed a new strategy. On May 21st, 1895, he wrote to James Werman and Frank's mother back in the United States. He asked them to gather Frank's cycling club mates and to again write letters. This time to congressmen, the State Department, newspapers, and business leaders. Saddlebin hoped that a public outcry in the U.S. would motivate powerful officials in Washington to demand more from the Ottoman government in Turkey. Shortly after posting his notes to Werman and Frank's mother, more information surfaced in Erzurum, this time from the Russian consulate. The Russian told Saddlebin that two Armenian men visiting his office claimed to know that Frank Lenz was killed by a Kurdish gang. The gang was led by a man named Mushto Nese. That name Mushto jumped to the top of Saddlebin's list of potential suspects. Since he still lacked any real authority, Saddlebin got creative. He found an Armenian man named Khazar Simonian, who'd previously done business with Mushto. Saddlebin offered to pay Khazar if he could get into Mushto's house and have a look around for him. Khazar accepted and soon reported back to Saddlebin. Khazar reported that in Mushto's house, he did notice some bicycle parts, including some very particular inner tubes for bicycle tires. They were brown inner tubes. Brown is a very unusual color for inner tubes, but Saddlebin knew, having seen the contents of Frank's unclaimed trunk, that Frank Lenz was using brown inner tubes. Saddlebin started asking villagers more about Mushto. People consistently described his reputation. Mushto was well known to be a ruthless criminal. None were surprised to hear he was suspected of murder. Saddlebin was so convinced Mushto was responsible that he wrote both to Frank's mother Anna and to Ambassador Terrell, stating he'd discovered Frank's murderer, who needed to be arrested. Alexander Terrell, though, remained hesitant. He didn't want to demand local authorities to make an arrest based on circumstantial evidence and without having the body. Newspapers in the United States, however, celebrated the news and celebrated Saddlebin's genius investigation. The papers in the U.S. also reported that now the State Department and Ambassador Alexander Terrell were stifling Saddlebin's progress and refusing to demand the murderer's arrest. Placing any blame on Terrell may or may not have been Saddlebin's intention. Either way, it made Alexander Terrell furious, especially because, unbeknownst to Saddlebin, Terrell did meet with the Ottoman Sultan, Abdul Hamid, on July 12th of 1895 and asked for Mushto's arrest. Hamid refused the request, though, without more evidence. So far, Saddlebin's idea to pressure U.S. officials hadn't accomplished anything other than further alienating him from Terrell. That is, until August 13th, 1895, when Ambassador Terrell received instructions from the now U.S. Secretary of State Alvey Addy. Secretary Addy directed Terrell to make the Lenz case his highest priority and to use all resources to secure Turkish assistance in order to pursue search warrants and arrests. Only a few days after the U.S. Secretary of State got involved, the Ottoman government sent William Saddlebin more assistance than he could have ever imagined. Ottoman authorities dispatched a popular military officer named Shakir Pasha and a team of 30 soldiers for the sole purpose of assisting William Saddlebin. Pasha had the authority to conduct searches and make arrests, but didn't plan on simply executing them at Saddlebin's whim. First, Shakir Pasha had to be convinced. After arriving in Erzurum, the Turkish officer created a sort of makeshift grand jury hearing to hear witnesses. Saddlebin was a witness, and Pasha was the sole juror. To Saddlebin's delight, at the hearing's conclusion, Pasha ordered his men to arrest Mushto Nesey, along with 5 other Kurdish men, his suspected accomplices. Somehow, though, the suspects were tipped off that their arrests were imminent. 4 of them fled the region. Only 2 were arrested. Saddlebin remained satisfied, however, because the ringleader, Mushto, was one of the 2 that was arrested. Saddlebin was present when Mushto was arrested. As the soldiers took Mushto away, he looked directly at William Saddlebin and uttered something the American didn't understand. Later, Saddlebin's interpreter explained that Mushto, while looking at Saddlebin, said, "I would like to run my sharp knife across his throat." Mushto denied any involvement in Lenz's murder. He said he found the bicycle parts and the inner tubes in the desert. Saddlebin knew more evidence was still needed for a conviction, and while Mushto awaited trial in prison, the investigation continued, although Shakir Pasha was now in charge. Soon, Pasha discovered something that changed everything. In a nearby village, he found 5 Armenian men who had stashed away small pieces of a bicycle. These were the same men and the same bicycle parts that Saddlebin found early in his own investigation. The Armenians found the parts near a river by their homes, and it was Saddlebin himself who'd asked the Armenians to hold on to them in case they were needed for evidence. To Pasha, however, if bicycle parts were evidence enough to arrest Mushto, then bicycle parts should be evidence enough to arrest these 5 Armenians too. The soldiers took all 5 to prison. Saddlebin was devastated. He told Pasha he knew about those bicycle parts. The Armenians previously volunteered the parts, and that it was Saddlebin himself who asked the Armenians to hold on to them. Saddlebin apologized to Pasha, saying he'd forgotten to tell him about those bicycle parts. He pleaded with Pasha to let the Armenians go, but Saddlebin's pleas fell on deaf ears. In fact, Pasha scolded Saddlebin for withholding evidence. Saddlebin started wondering if he could trust Pasha, if maybe Pasha's men tipped off the Kurds who escaped arrest. Why were his pleas being ignored? Were they trying to pin the murder on the Armenians? Each suspect was, shortly after, individually brought before a Turkish judge. For each of them, the judge would make a final decision whether the evidence was sufficient for a trial. Saddlebin was a foreigner and not permitted to testify this time. Instead, he submitted a written explanation in advance, including a thorough account of his investigation and opinions. Saddlebin then waited and hoped that the judge would see the truth, that he'd pursue the case against Mushto and his accomplice, and even more so, Saddlebin hoped the judge would set the Armenians free. It was now October of 1895. Saddlebin had been in Turkey for 9 months. He'd come to learn that this was a place where justice was hard to find. But it wasn't until October 30th that Saddlebin witnessed the most horrific injustice of his life. Throughout his months in Erzurum, he remained living with his friend, the Canadian missionary, William Chambers. They both knew that Christians were being slaughtered by Kurds in eastern Turkey, and on October 30th, thousands of Kurds entered Erzurum. Saddlebin and Chambers, both Christians, had to run for their lives. They luckily found a suitable hiding place. Many Armenians did not. After the sounds of barbarity subsided, Saddlebin and Chambers emerged to find the Kurds in only 2 hours, killed over 1,000 Armenians in Erzurum. Over the next few days, Saddlebin focused on helping to bury the bodies. The attack on Erzurum was minor compared to some others. Between 1894 and 1896, over 300,000 people were killed. The Ottoman Sultan, Abdul Hamid, was mainly using Kurdish men, fellow Muslims in the region, as soldiers. He was attempting to remove all Christian Armenians from his empire. Hamid was frighteningly successful, and although his empire crumbled after World War I, the region remained brutally violent for generations. Saddlebin had finally had enough of Turkey. He started making plans to return home. As he prepared, the judge announced his decision on the Frank Lenz murder trials. Mushto's accomplice would be immediately released, and charges were dropped for lack of evidence. As for Mushto and the 5 Armenians, all 6 were indicted. They'd be held in prison until their trials began. Consistent with so many other instances of injustice in this place, within days of the decision, Mushto Nese, with help from fellow Kurds, escaped from prison and fled the region. Mushto never saw the inside of a courtroom or prison again. The Armenians remained in prison. Their conditions were so poor that 2 of the 5 died in prison before their trials were held. Saddlebin was dejected. He concluded that in this place, finding justice was impossible. Before he left, he hoped at least to convince higher authorities to allow the remaining 3 Armenians to bond out of prison as they awaited trial. All 3 were released on bond on January 6, 1896. Saddlebin would be able to travel home with a small victory accomplished. All 3 Armenians immediately fled the region. They too never saw the inside of a Turkish prison or courtroom again. The trials, though, for Mushto and the Armenians went ahead with all defendants in absentia. On March 17, 1897, a panel of 4 judges found all of them, Mushto and the Armenians, not guilty. Saddlebin didn't care at all that he'd missed the trials or the verdicts. By that time, he'd been far from Turkey for weeks. William Saddlebin's departure from Turkey didn't leave the Lenz case forgotten there. Ambassador Alexander Terrell resigned and left the Ottoman Empire on July 15, 1897, and the newly appointed ambassador, a man named James Engel, kept the Lenz case alive. Engel didn't expect they'd track down any suspects, but he thought at least the government should pay an indemnity to Frank's mother, Anna, symbolizing their failure to protect her son, an American traveling in their territory, and also their failure to deliver justice to those responsible after the fact. For a payment to Anna to even be possible, though, he needed recognition legally that Frank Lenz was murdered there. The suspect's acquittals in 1896 meant no legal record existed proving Frank Lenz was, in fact, murdered. Therefore, James Engel appealed all of the previous defendants' acquittals. His arguments were successful, and the appeals were granted. Mushto Nese and the 3 surviving Armenians were tried again in absentia for murder in December 1897. This time, they were all found guilty. The court ceremoniously handed down 15-year sentences to each of them. Of course, without Engel's ultimate goal in mind, his appeal and the second trials with still missing defendants would have been pretty ridiculous. None of the now convicted defendants were ever found or even pursued. But with the convictions, the U.S. State Department now confidently demanded a $200,000 indemnity payment be made to Frank's mother, Anna. However, James Engel's success ended with the convictions. The Ottoman government refused the claim, citing that Frank entered the country voluntarily and he was aware of the dangers he might encounter. Still, the United States didn't forget about Frank's mother. 4 years later, in 1901, the newly elected president, William McKinley, negotiated with Sultan Abdul Hamid a payment to settle all historical and outstanding claims the United States had against the Ottoman Empire. This included a reduced payment to settle the Lenz case. In 1902, Frank's mother received $7,500, and for her, acknowledgement from the place and from the people, in her mind, who were responsible for her son's death, and who failed to find his body or his murderers. At first, Anna hoped to use the money to go find her son's body herself, but only a year later, Anna's husband was injured in an accident at work and left paralyzed, making it necessary for her to stay focused on matters at home. William Saddleman was in Turkey twice as long as he expected to be, and he left there feeling deep sadness and disappointment. Those close to him commented that upon returning home, he looked as if he'd aged several decades. He'd been there just over a year. Saddleman's hometown newspaper in Illinois provided an optimistic but appropriate description of his efforts, saying, "His mission was not entirely successful, but it was daring, determined, and patriotic." Saddleman himself was most saddened by his failure to find Frank's body and return the boy to his mother. On his way home to Illinois, Saddleman stopped to see Frank's mother in Pittsburg. He delivered Frank's unclaimed trunk to Anna, saying he was sorry that it was all he had to offer. She was nonetheless grateful to him for everything he did. Frank's mother, Anna, remained in Pittsburg the rest of her life. She died in 1923 at the age of 82. After William Saddleman returned home, he went on a 2-year nationwide speaking tour to inform Americans about the tragic plight of the Armenians in eastern Turkey. And he still craved adventure. After his speaking tour, he joined an expedition to Alaska to report on the Klondike Gold Rush. Coincidentally, these reports were published in Outing magazine, although by that time it had long since been sold by James Werman. Saddleman later briefly considered joining an expedition to the North Pole, but he withdrew just before its departure, citing the determined opposition of a certain young lady. William Saddleman married May Merriman in 1903. They settled in Houston, Texas, where they owned and operated a theater together. William Saddleman died in 1953. He was 87 years old. Most likely, Frank Lenz remains buried in the sand along the banks of a small river near the old city of Erzurum in eastern Turkey. The names of places, rivers, and landforms came and went quickly in that region in the 20th century. Cities and villages have had multiple different names since Frank Lenz and William Saddleman visited. Despite the best efforts and hopes of so many people, history has no record of exactly where Frank Lenz died, or exactly how he died, or, for sure, who caused his death. But, thankfully, history did capture quite a bit about his truly extraordinary life.